Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah, and in this video, I'm going to give you some of a presentation I did in a conference on deuterium, but it also touches on bad science because a lot of really important things that we need to research or are the bleeding obvious are not researched. And then you'll get to see who holds a lot of the wealth. And again, these kind of companies can control research. So I'm going to focus on deuterium, but I'm also going to talk about other aspects of quantum biology so that people don't think that depleting deuterium is just about drinking deuterium depleted water. If you want to do it properly, there are lots of other things you can do as well that are going to positively impact your life. In very simple terms, we can talk about deuterium and hydrogen as the energy giver and the energy thief. But I don't want to make deuterium out to be bad, because without deuterium, we wouldn't exist. And it plays a very important role in how stars shine and how the sun makes light. But just in the context of health, too much deuterium is a problem. The problem with the junk food and the non-food is these companies just love your belly, and they also want to take over your brain, because I do work with people who've got serious sort of food addictions, and it's like a bar of chocolate or a packet of crisps has managed to hijack their brain. So it is pretty scary, some of the intricate science that's gone into making this rubbishy non-food. And just for people who are new to all this has been going on for about 50 years, and you've participated in an experiment that was against your will. And when it comes to fad diets and diets that have money revolving around them, like meal replacement shakes and Weight Watchers and veganism and things like that, we don't have any data on it because they're all new. However, there are some useful cohort studies. For example, there was I'm pretty sure it was a 10-year study on women and eating less and moving more. And there was a pretty large quantity of women in this study, thousands. And over the 10 years, the ones who ate less and moved more lost a grand total of £0.5 pound compared to the control group. So, however, we do have data on low-carb diets, because back in the 1800s, William Banting used them for helping his patients, and he took notes. And then from the turn of the century onwards, we've got quite a lot of data on ketogenic diets and epilepsy, and now there's a lot more studies appearing. So as much as people want to say keto or carnivore, whatever shit, if they looked back in the research, it's the only kind of way of eating I've actually got a long-term study on. And because keto and carnivore and such like are not approved of, unlike Ansel Keys's work, the studies that have managed to get out had to fight their way through the bureaucracy. The other problem with the junk food industry is how much it's worth. So back in 2020, it was worth about 800 billion, and it's projected to grow to over 1,000 or 1,400 billion by 2028. So bear in mind, this gives them a huge amount of power to influence research and do their own research and whatever else that they want to do. And just to keep things very simple about junk food, it's a massive deuterium bomb. It's like the worst food for having huge amounts of deuterium in it. But of course, they don't want you to know that. The other problem are the tech companies, because like the big food companies, the amount of wealth they hold is pretty massive. So Apple's got nearly $3 trillion, which is pretty massive. Google's nearly 2 trillion. And then things like Meta, that's about 900 billion. And then Netflix, 200 billion. So the problem with tech, we do need to use it, but there's lots of ways to use tech wisely. But also, again, you don't want to let tech take over your world and over your head and be controlled by it, because the problem with screens and tech use is it's the artificial blue light, because it's really going to tank and steal your dopamine. So just bear in mind, the tech companies want your money and your dopamine, but you can keep the dopamine from them. So just use your screens wisely. Things like Flux and Iris, only use them when you have to. There's a lot I could go into, but I just want to show you the sort of money behind the tech industry. In order to walk people into this talk, sometimes it's good to just look at things like the basic building blocks, like electrons, photons, hydrogen, deuterium, oxygen, water, nitrogen, and carbon, and just make it basic so that we can understand more complex things later. So with electrons, they don't have a mass, but they have a negative charge, and they have something called particle and wave duality, so they can behave as both, same as light can. And electrons are fundamental for our life force. Without them, when they stop flowing around the body, then we're not alive anymore. Photons or quanta of light. So quanta just means it comes out in packets or in little specific amounts. It's not just a constant beam of light. And the way in which light and electrons interact with each other, it's very organized that certain wavelengths of light need to excite electrons in a certain way for things to happen in the body. And this is why electrons and light carry information as well. So they don't just carry a charge, and light doesn't just light up your room. It's actually carrying information from the sun, from your food, all the way around your body. So there's more to electrons and photons. I won't go into it now. Then hydrogen is something that's kind of overlooked. So it's the first element of the periodic table, the smallest, and it has a proton and an electron. And just for simple terms, without hydrogen and deuterium, the sun wouldn't be there. And hydrogen is the biggest energy giver in the body. And it's also the best antioxidant, or one of, like an electron, because hydrogen and electrons are very, very tiny. So they can get everywhere in the body and act as antioxidants, whereas a lot of supplements are just too big and they can't get past the hydration shells in the body. So the water's in the way and the supplements can't get through. Deuterium is what we'd say heavy hydrogen. So it's an isotope. It's, like I said, it's not radioactive. It's not toxic unless there's too much of it. And the fact it's got a neutron means it's completely different to hydrogen in many ways. Even though it's still a hydrogen, it still has an atomic number of 1. So this neutron makes it twice the size. It changes how deuterium bonds with things. So deuterium can bond tighter. It changes bond angles. Deuterium's got different light properties, and also deuterium has a magnetic moment, and that's why it's used in NMR studies, as in sort of imaging or looking at protein structure. And then, of course, water is fundamentally important because it contains hydrogen, electrons, and oxygen. And of course, carbon, because that's what we're built from. But then carbon dioxide is something that people think's just a thing we breathe out and a waste product, but it's actually a really important signaling molecule. So let's just dive into light. Just to keep it simple, light is the primary driver of biology in terms of our light and dark cycle. Without that, our body clocks would just be chaos. But then there's a lot more that light does. So it, again, sets our body clocks, but also light provides us with energy because it charges our electrons. So like I said, electrons have their role in the body, but they also need to be charged by light. They need to get information and energy from light. And this is what we would call the photoelectric effect by Einstein. And our biology is programmed to the wavelengths that come from the sun. So that's the ultraviolet, the visible, and the infrared. So anything else outside that spectrum, like radio waves, Wi-Fi, X-rays, or whatever things we've created, our biology isn't designed to respond to those. So that's why, in very simple terms, they're problematic, simply because we're geared towards receiving information from the sun, and also things like the Schumann resonance, the heartbeat of the earth, and anything artificial is going to confuse our biology. And when biology gets confused, we just call it chaos or inflammation. With the sun being the master clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, that receives light from the sun. So that's your master clock in the body. And then this signal oscillates down the body because we have clocks in all of our organs so that they know what they're supposed to do at a given time. Our cells have clocks in them. And the cell cycle is a timing mechanism in the body. So in very simple terms, with a cell cycle, that's when the cell, it's like being told whether it should divide or whether it should commit suicide. And this is absolutely vital because sometimes we need more cells and other times we need old cells to die. When it comes to improving your health and your lifespan, the more in sync your body clocks are, the better the timing, the longer your health span and the longer your lifespan. And there are lots of studies on circadian biology. This is something that people have been interested in for a long time. If we consider water, most people are familiar with steam and ice and water, but then the fourth phase of water, the gel-like phase, or the hexagonal water, the coherent water, the living water, or the gel water, particularly sort of focusing on Dr. Gerald Pollack's work, and he has a whole book on it, The Fourth Phase of Water. So it's something, again, that's not studied enough, but vitally important. And in terms of what we've been talking about, when the water creates the exclusion zone, it makes these hexagonal arrangements, and each hexagon can pop out an electron. So as we were looking at before, electrons are something important. And the more we have, the better. The reason this exclusion zone water is so important, there are so many things that it does. So it coats all surfaces in the body. It hydrates the proteins in our semiconductor system. So it's fundamental for our water battery and communication system. It's really important for blood flow. And Dr. Stephanie Seneff's been on the channel talking about this. It's important for hydrating receptors and proteins. It helps the ATPase in your mitochondria spin. Because it's an exclusion zone, the water charge separates and it excludes everything bigger than a potassium. So it acts like as a natural detoxification process in your body by excluding toxins. We need it to hydrate collagen so that we can move easily. It lubricates our sort of biological machines. And what I find really interesting is the brain has the most EZ water or exclusion zone water, yet nobody talks about water and brain health or mental health. When we go into magnetism, I just brought this up now because this relates to what I'm going to talk about later, which is the deuterium. So magnetism, again, like the sun, our body's programmed to the natural magnetic fields of the earth and the celestial bodies, and like the moon and planets and things like that. And our mitochondria and our blood are magnetic. So most people think, oh yeah, of course, well, there's iron in the blood. But with the ATPase, the reason it's a magnet is because it's something spinning with protons going through it at 90 degrees to a current, which is or a flow of negative charge, which would be the electrons. And then DHA in the SN2 positions paramagnetic as well. So this idea of light and water and magnetism is sometimes something people aren't sure about how it works in the beginning, but then when you break it down and just walk people through, they can see, oh yeah, I get why the water's important. I can see now there are these sort of magnetic components in my body. So when we talk about deuterium, we need to remember that this ATPase is really vital for our health because it spins and it makes ATP. And if we break the ATPase or damage it, then the whole mitochondria is going to be damaged as well. And then that's going to affect the cell. If we consider sort of electricity, because again, we're an electric being, and modern medicine doesn't refute this in any way because we've got brain scans and ECGs, EEGs. And if we don't have electrons flowing in our semiconductors in the body, then again, we're dead. So it's really important. Collagen, that's piezoelectric because it creates a current when you stimulate it with movement, or mechanical stress is sort of the proper word. From Dr. Robert O'Becker's work, he did a lot on how low levels of light and electricity are vital for bone healing and bone health. And in fact, bones are an LED, a light-emitting diode, and they emit red light. And the copper atoms in the semiconductor in the bone are really important for how it functions. But then nobody takes any notice of this and just stuffed Robert O'Becker's work as much under the carpet as possible. So again, there's lots of things that we know already. It's just other people don't want you to know about. And then supplement companies will just try and sell you calcium supplements for osteoporosis, which is basically just calcium carbonate that's chalk, when bones, like I just said, are a very intricate, complicated semiconductor, and just eating calcium is not the solution to the osteoporosis problem. Then if we now just finish off by talking about deuterium, and here's an example of why a lot of people have never heard about it, because it's not sexy. Off camera, Dr. Gabor Shomalai told me that he'd applied for funding from the EU for deuterium depletion studies on cancer, looking at deuterium depleted water, because he wanted to make something that was effective and non-toxic and available for cancer patients. And again, the EU said no, the computer of the EU said no. They obviously would rather fund studies that are going to make toxic, expensive therapies. So here we are. This is why deuterium is something you've not heard about. Another thing which is important, so since caveman time, the atmospheric oxygen's down by 10%. So that matters because that's the terminal acceptor of electrons in your mitochondria. So it's the end of the chain. So if you don't have enough oxygen in the mitochondria, then the mitochondria can't function properly. And 5G interacts with atmospheric oxygen and makes this problem worse. And this has been known for a long time. It's just, again, not public knowledge, but I don't think people would like it if they knew that something was stealing their breathing air, their oxygen. The other problem we've got, this is why I mentioned magnetism, is it's gone down by about 90%, because it initially, I think millions or whenever years ago, was about 5 Gauss, and now it's down to about half a Gauss. So we've just got less magnetism now, and our bodies, like I said, are dependent on magnetic fields. The other problem that we have is there's 10% more deuterium, and I don't know the exact reason why, but like I said, it's involved in sort of natural processes regarding how the sun and stars function. So just generally in the environment, there's 10% more deuterium. But there could be other factors regarding industry. I don't know. It's something I can find out. So with deuterium, like I said, it's an isotope of hydrogen, and the planet is about 150 to 155 parts per million. And for our health, we ideally want to be between about 130 and 140 parts per million of deuterium. Low is fine. Unfortunately, when it starts to go above 140 and definitely over 150 parts per million, that's when health really deteriorates. And when it goes over 180 parts per million in a person, that's like really bad. And nobody disputes this. Those who've studied deuterium have seen this in their patients, and there's a direct correlation with aging, inflammation, cancer, diabetes, insulin resistance, and all sorts, the more deuterium you have. So when it comes to food and deuterium, Dr. Gabor Chomely has done lots of dehydration experiments on carbs and fat and other things. And carbohydrates, as in glucose, because they're a hydrated hydrocarbon, they're about 150 to 150 parts per million. So if I was explaining this to my mother, I've just told her, for example, that it's the healthy range is 130 parts per million to 140, whereas carbohydrates are 150 to 150 parts per million. So it's not difficult to work out that if you ate lots of carbohydrates all the time, you're going to have high deuterium levels in yourself. And then on the other hand, the fat, it has low deuterium. So it's between about 109 to 120 parts per million, because fat's just a hydrocarbon. And with fats, I just want to make the point that seed oils don't obey this rule, because they can be 160 to actually over 200 parts per million. So that's another reason why seed oils are so bad. If we look into food now, so only about 30% of our energy in terms of protons and electrons come from food. And these protons and electrons will go into the mitochondria, and what comes out the other end is deuterium depleted water. So your mitochondria make deuterium depleted water, and if they're working properly, it'll have 0 deuterium in it. The mitochondria make energy, as we know, ATP, but that's not the primary energy source. They make heat, they make light, and they make carbon dioxide. So the light and the carbon dioxide in particular are for signaling. And also that the mitochondria, electron transport chains aside, can make things like pregnenolone, they can make melatonin, they can make dopamine. From the food, we get the hydrogens or the protons, and they power the ATPase. So remember, we want protons, hydrogens, not deuterium. And then in terms of just simply looking at energy, fat has twice as many electrons than carbs. So it just means it's number one, a better fuel in that sense. The other thing which is really important is, how do we make deuterium depleted water from the mitochondria? So if we use fat as a fuel, we get, just say for argument's sake, 1 equivalent of water. If we have protein, that's 0.75 equivalent, so still a decent amount of water. And then if we use carbohydrates as a fuel, we only make 0.5 or half as much water as we could from fat. So it's just, again, in very simple language for people who don't understand things like this, sorry if you do, that it makes sense that fat is the best fuel for the mitochondria to help them make deuterium depleted water. And we don't want deuterium in the mitochondria because, first of all, the deuterium is going to break the ATPase. So that's the spinning motor because it's too big. And when the ATPase breaks, the mitochondria itself is now going to be struggling. When cells or organelles struggle, the first thing they do is get inflamed. So this is like a recipe for getting systemic inflammation in the body. If the deuterium's in a particular organ and the mitochondria get damaged or killed, then that organ's going to suffer. So we don't want deuterium in the mitochondria. However, just before people get scared or worried, nature's very clever. And like I said, deuterium's been here ever since the sun started shining. So we have steps in our body that can help protect us from deuterium accidentally getting in. So the first one is something called glycolysis, because glucose can act as a sort of smuggler and bring deuterium in. So we have checkpoints, and glycolysis is just a series of reactions where the glucose gets broken down and then fed into the Krebs cycle. So during this breaking down process, the cell machinery can check for deuterium and keep things sort of nice and clean. Then we have something called the Krebs cycle, and I won't go into it in detail, but also, again, this is another checkpoint. So all of this complicated cycle before feeding electrons and protons into the mitochondria is to make sure that no deuterium are going to get in. And if you're healthy and you don't have a deuterium problem, all of this will be working well. The other time where deuterium is a big problem is it can block up the Krebs cycle, and then it stops being a cycle. It doesn't work properly anymore. And then reagents and things start to build up. This is something Dr. Borosh talks about of molecular crowding. So the Krebs cycle isn't going properly anymore because there's deuterium in it. So things build up, and then this buildup of partially broken down fats and sugars can then lead to other problems, as you can imagine. So in simple terms, what can we do from a food perspective to minimize our deuterium or start to deplete it? So we'd want to eat fat and protein from animal and marine sources. Professor Michael Crawford's on the channel, so you can learn all about DHA and fish and all of the bad studies that have been done in that department in another video. And plants are less fussy about deuterium than animals are, but again, some plant fats or many plant fats are still low in deuterium. Things like macadamia nuts are low, coconut oil is low, olive oil is fine as long as you don't cook with it. Then if you avoid seed oils, seeds, beans, because they're a deuterium bomb, because deuterium is really important as a growth factor. So that's why seeds and beans are full of them, because they're the plant's baby. And it's the deuterium's in there for a baby plant to grow, not for you. The other thing is, don't eat fruit and vegetables that are out of season, because first of all, they're giving you completely the wrong information from the sun. But secondly, say if you ate a pineapple or a mango in the UK in winter, the amount of deuterium in that, we're not capable of depleting that deuterium properly, because winter is a much more ketotic sort of fasting scarcity time. We just don't have the UV light to be able to deplete it. Then avoid things that pretend to be food from factories, because they are a super deuterium bomb, and also supplements that you don't need. Because remember that the supplement companies and the food companies don't care about you. They just want your money. So of course they're not going to bother to fractionate deuterium and hydrogen in the production, because it would cost them more money. And as always, don't panic if you do eat a carb, because like I've said before, if you live where the plants grow, and if your hobby is growing vegetables on your allotment, like my dad, his hobby is growing vegetables in his garden, I don't really see what's wrong with that, because they're all programmed with the sun. They come out at certain times of the year when there's enough sunlight to deal with the deuterium, because you do have two checkpoints. So like anything, just beating yourself up over something or being frightened of carbs sometimes isn't helpful. And remember, your body, if it's healthy, will be able to deal with the accidental sort of eating of glucose. Remember your two checkpoints in the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. But the thing is, it's not just about food, because if you've got a bad body clock and bad sleep, you can't really heal or detox, and you can't deplete deuterium properly. So you might eat really well, but if you're not sleeping, you're taking away one of your body's deuterium depleting pathways. And something else which is important is, if you don't have enough red light, then the deuterium can't get out. So that's why red light from the sun in particular is the best, the near infrared. But then a red light panel used properly can be helpful. But remember, you can only use that for 10 minutes a day. You can't just sit in front of it all day. So again, just going out, regardless of the time of year, in the red light and the near infrared from the sun is going to be helpful. Too much blue light does all sorts of things, but it also encourages deuterium to stay in the body. Cold thermogenesis can deplete deuterium. So again, whatever nature gives us, there's always an antidote. So we have the cold, especially in winter, where we can knock ourselves out with that and deplete deuterium. Of course, saunas and sweating, as in exercise as well, is going to deplete deuterium, because remember, water is H2O, and you're going to get some H2Ds as well, deuterium water. So that'll come out in the sweat and the pee. As I mentioned before, UV light and sunlight, as in the high solar yield, the strong UVA light, and that can help deplete deuterium. So that's why if you live where the plants grow, such as the equator, then you live where they grow. So you've got a better capacity to deplete the deuterium. But if you live at the equator, you shouldn't tell people that don't live there to eat tropical fruit, because you're just inviting sort of a deuterium bomb in them. Hopefully now you can see what the input and the output systems are with deuterium, and there's like the processing in the middle. So if you limit how much you take in, keep your body healthy, so that's like the processing part, and then do activities to deplete deuterium, you'll be able to keep it under control. I hope you found it useful, and if you want to learn more or work with me, I have a monthly coaching group where we have live Zooms, an open forum, group activities like fasting or leptin resets and all sorts of other things. You're welcome to join there. I've also got a variety of courses if you are interested. There's an offer on at the moment on my Quantum Biology Foundations course, because I'm making a new course, a much more in-depth one with protocols. But starting from the beginning can be really beneficial for people. And also I have a course on minerals, which now has 3 bonus modules with it if you want to take a deep dive into minerals, because again, that they are very basic foundations of nutrition. I mentioned we talked about hydrogen, electrons and things like that, but minerals are something that a lot of people miss as well, and they're cheap and simple. So thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.